But there's an interesting distinction here that comes all the way from Aristotle. Aristotle talked about the properties of things and the complexity of things, and he separated everything into two pieces: the essential complexity that's there versus the accidental complexity that's there. When you start thinking about software in terms of essential versus accidental complexity, some interesting things kind of fall out of that. In fact, the current state of the world in Java right now is we're using a lot of this. Oh, wait a minute, that's not legal. God, I always forget this. I'm going to put that stupid thing on there. XML is one of those things that seemed like a really good idea at the time, but now we're starting to have some misgivings. This next slide is my favorite current slide of seemed like a good idea at the time. The thing I love about this is you can just see the thought process that went on here. Like, well, I'd really like to sit in the pool because it's hot and I'd like to run the barbecue, but the cord's not long enough. Hey, I've got a power strip. What's funny about this is that, notice that it is in fact a round plug, so that's 220 volts of electricity. I'm sure this seemed like a really, really good idea right up until the time the ambulance arrived for these guys. And XML is one of those things in the Java world. In fact, one of my colleagues suggests that Sun was handing out XML on the playground like drug dealers do. Here, the first one's free. Just use this, it'll be fine. And then before long, you're an addict. And you're looking for a good XML editor. What's interesting about this is the entire goal behind the heavy use of XML in Java was so that we can do late binding for configuration, so that we wouldn't have to recompile the code that we wrote when we want to configure our frameworks. Because remember, all this XML is really being used as configuration for the frameworks that we've got. And what we really wanted was late binding for the configuration information. So really, viewed in that light, XML is really just an external DSL to hold late bound configuration information. But what always happens is people used XML so much that they're like, oh, we got to figure out a way to get rid of some of this XML. So they moved a bunch of that stuff to attributes, which is no longer late bound. So you've actually gotten rid of the entire advantage of using XML just so that you don't have to use XML anymore. So why did everybody buy into XML so much in the Java world? Well, the main reason is it's really, really easy to parse. You don't have to build your own grammar. You've already got parsers for XML, Sax and DOM, and it's easy to parse this stuff. But then the question becomes, how much is too much? So we've been using XML as our default external DSL for a long time, but it has some really bad characteristics. One, it's really hard to refactor. In fact, we do have some tools now that allow you to do refactoring on it, but it's not nearly as rich as in code. The other thing it does is encourages wetness, meaning violations of the dry or don't repeat yourself principle, meaning that the primary way that you reuse XML is by copy and paste. And we'd never do that in code. We know that's a terrible idea in code, and yet XML kind of encourages that behavior. It also frightens non-developers. You try to show them an XML configuration file, and they're afraid they'll get cut because there's so many sharp edges. And it just looks awful to try to read that stuff. In fact, just as general advice, you shouldn't cuddle sharp things because you'll get hurt when you do that. Now, the gateway drug to most Java developers for XML was Ant. And it seemed like such a good idea, but in fact, the guy who created Ant about 3 years ago publicly apologized. In fact, his name is James Duncan Davidson. He created Ant and Tomcat, and he has neither of them on his laptop now. In fact, he was so scarred from that experience, he has now left software. Now he's a professional photographer. That's what XML can do to you. So as far as I'm concerned, XML as a data format for configuration is deprecated. I would much rather keep behavior in code. There are lots of really good ways to do that now, even for the places where XML shows up everywhere like Ant, because there are a ton of really good alternatives to Ant that use code instead of XML. XML is marginally okay as a data format, but you should keep behavior in code. And I'll show you how deeply this is penetrated into the Java world. This is too small for you to possibly read, but what is this just by the shape of it? See? Somebody over here recognized it right away. It's a struts configuration file. Even if it's too small to read, just the shape of it, you can tell what it is. That's a cry for help. And the problem, if you take a snippet of this struts configuration file, let's say that what you really want to do is make sure that the minimum, maximum value for the database connection pool and the minimum value is always separated by 4. You always want the max to be 4 greater than the min. So how do you do that in XML? Well, you just have to remember, anytime I change max, I have to go back and change min too to make sure that there's 4 between the two of them. But I have some news for you. There's been this radical, cool invention in the software world fairly recently. It's called a variable. And what you can do is put things in variables, and then you don't have to repeat them over and over again as constants. You can refer to them by their variable name. And so if you take that exact same struts configuration file and write it in as a Groovy builder file, this is that same thing. This emits that exact same XML file that I was just showing you, and yet this is in code. And at the top, it uses these variables so that you can set a value for the max count and the count diff, and then within the code, you can impose the rule that says, well, there's where my max count is, and I always want my min count to be the difference in max and min. And you don't have to remember to do that or copy and paste it anymore because the variables do that for you. One of the really interesting things about DSLs is context and the ability to execute things in different contexts. Let me give you an example of this. This is the attempt that Struts made to create variables in XML. And it's awful. I mean, look at this variable thing, this block with variable name and variable value. That's also a cry for help. The classic example of this is the one I showed you before, the Rails code that handles this stuff automatically for you because it understands that this is within the context of a customer and validates presence of name, handles validation in all the different places you need, the UI, the workflow, the database, etc. Let me give you another example of this idea of context. This is a little Ruby DSL. And what I'm doing is modeling the relationship between farms and cows. So I can say here that a farm has many cows, a cow has one farm, and a cow has a name and an age. The way that you write this code is to do something like this. Property there, let's look at property age, for example. Property is really just a class level method, a static method that gets executed as you load the class. It's just like a static initializer in Java. And what that code looks like is something like this. And what it does is go through and create an internal representation of that variable in a hash, and then it dynamically generates on the fly a get method and a set method. Of course, in Ruby, you don't have to put get and set in front of them. It's just the name of the variable. But it creates a getter setter for you on the fly. So when you say cow has property age, it automatically creates a getter and setter for you. So you now have a fully fledged object that has those characteristics, a data object.